Three, two, one. In this lesson, we will look at some common argument structures that you can use for the vast majority of the critical reasoning argument tasks that you'll encounter in the verbal reasoning section and some of the data insights two-part analysis questions on the Gmat focus. So let's first just revisit our friend, the argumentation equation. We know that a premise or the objective facts providing support plus an assumption or assumptions, which are your implied, unstated facts that must be true, lead to a subjective opinion that required all this support, known as the conclusion. So, our argument task basic predictions, when it talks about strengthening, you need to find information in one of the choices to show that whatever a predicted assumption is, that it's likely to be valid. Conversely, if you're being asked to weaken an argument, you need to find information in a choice to show that whatever a predicted assumption is unlikely to be valid. For a flaw, you're looking for something that articulates why a predicted assumption is inherently unlikely. So you're like, this doesn't seem valid to start with. And for an assumption, you need to find information in a choice that is absolutely necessary to lead logically to your conclusion. So let's just categorize our common argument types. So you can note your argument type based on the categorical supporting information. So if you have a causality, that's saying that because A happened, B guaranteed is going to happen. A representative sample means you take some sort of sample size and apply it to a larger whole. Data or evidence interpretation is literally what it says. It's taking some data or some evidence and going, okay, based on this, I believe that. An analogy simply means that two items are comparable in some sort of reasonable ways, and a plan or recommendation argument type basically means we're going to do the plan that is presented. Strategically, if you can identify a common argument type in your prompt, this will expedite the process of elimination with a more specific prediction. And you want to recognize that many arguments can be categorized as more than one type. So it's up to you to decide what is most apparent in the moment when you're addressing the problem. But most GMAT arguments, and honestly, all arguments for that matter, can be reduced to either a causality that because this happened, the other thing happened, or a plan or recommendation that we're going to do this thing for the reasons that are outlined. So if you're struggling to identify an argument type, you can probably just say it's a causality or it's a plan/recommendation type argument. So let's take a look at the common argument structure, starting with a causality. So a causality is predicated on the fact that because A happened, B happened, and it's guaranteed. So the assumption is that there are no other possible causes and that the described relationship is not coincidental. So let's take a look at an example. We have Regina observed her cat coughing at the same time that its water dish was empty. Therefore, Regina supposed that her cat was coughing due to dehydration. So the conclusion is that second part of the second sentence, which is the cat is coughing due to dehydration. Now, our assumption is that there's no other possible cause for the cat coughing except for the dehydration because the water dish was empty, and that it's not simply a coincidence that the cat is coughing at the same time that the water dish is empty. So these are your general assumptions and the way that a causality works, and you can pretty much make any argument that is presented into a causality if you don't see one of the other types immediately present. Then we come to representation. So a representation argument uses a representative sample to extrapolate to a larger population. And your assumption for every representation-based argument is that whatever your sample size is, it's representative of the whole, and there is no subtle term shift that would make the sample non-representative between the evidence and the conclusion. So let's take a look at another example. 1,000 people in Los Angeles were asked what type of dog they were most likely to purchase, and 97% responded poodle. Therefore, pet shops in the United States should primarily stock poodles. So, the conclusion is that US pet shops should primarily stock poodles. Simple enough. And the assumption here, first, is that Los Angeles is representative of the United States. And you probably identified that one pretty quickly. You're like, I can't extrapolate from Los Angeles to the entire country. That doesn't seem reasonable. But there's also a very subtle term shift here because the survey asks about dogs, but then the conclusion concerns itself with all pets. So That's another subtle term shift potential flaw or assumption because we don't know that dog means all pets. You might find out information about other pets besides dogs that may seem quote unquote irrelevant, but in fact, they end up being key because we don't know that dog is even the most popular pet necessarily from the information presented and the sample that is provided. Another example we've got is data or evidence interpretation. And so these are going to use discrete data or evidence to support some sort of hypothesis. And the assumption is that there's no additional data or evidence to change the original interpretation. So we've got another example. Too much money is spent fighting the Ebola virus. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, more flu cases annually. Furthermore, the flu killed hundreds of thousands more than did Ebola last year. So the conclusion is actually the first sentence here. Too much money is spent fighting Ebola. But the assumption is that there is no additional data or evidence available to change the original interpretation that too much money is spent fighting the Ebola virus because of the statistics provided that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, more flu cases annually, and the flu killed hundreds of thousands more. And if you think critically, you might be able to posit some additional statistics that might change this outcome if we find out that the flu has a mortality rate of 0.0005% because everybody gets the flu versus Ebola that maybe has a 50% mortality rate. Even though Ebola is rarer, we might be more concerned with it and want to spend money in combating that disease. Then we've got an analogy, or just that A is equal to B, and these arguments are going to use a comparison of items to infer some sort of relationship. And you are going to assume that the items are comparable in what relevant ways here. So, another example. At the turn of the 20th century, the island of Manhattan built a subway system to address transportation needs resulting from rapid population growth. At the turn of the 21st century, Bermuda also experienced rapid population growth, so it too probably built a subway system to address its transportation challenges. So the conclusion is that Bermuda probably built a subway at that time. And we're assuming that Bermuda is like Manhattan in relevant ways. So you could strengthen or weaken the argument. You'd strengthen it by showing Manhattan and Bermuda are similar. You'd weaken it by showing that they are not in this case. And our last of the common argumentation types is going to be a plan or recommendation based argument. So a plan or recommendation is simply going to present reasoning for taking a certain action. And the default conclusion for all plan or recommendation based arguments is that we will execute the plan or recommendation to do whatever the recommendation or plan is, because without execution, the plan or recommendation is ultimately moot. And not only do plan or recommendations have a default conclusion, they of course have a default assumption as well. And that's very important here, that the plan will work according to the specifically defined success metric. You have to make sure that you are addressing the specific way that the plan is intended to accomplish its goal, whatever that goal may be. So we have another example here. The reintroduction of the wolf to our national park has been a success, but now wolves are preying on many of the other animals native to the park. Therefore, it would be advisable to double the number of hunting permits granted per year to lower the wolf population in the park. So the conclusion is simply to execute the plan to double the number of hunting permits granted per year. Now, the assumption is that this plan will specifically work to accomplish the goal of lowering the park's wolf population. You have to be careful when you're evaluating plan and recommendation type arguments to not just grab some statement that seems broadly positive or broadly negative. For instance, here, any information pertaining to the number of wolf hunting permits having driven profits for the national park would ultimately be irrelevant because it doesn't necessarily address the issue of lowering the wolf population, even though probably driving greater profits for the park would be a net positive. It doesn't specifically address the goal of this plan directly. So let's head on over to the whiteboard and take a look at an example and see how we can apply our knowledge of these common arguments to help expedite our critical reasoning argument task processes on the verbal reasoning section of the Gmat Focus Edition. Here we have a sample critical reasoning question, and we'll set up our answer choices A through E as always. And we can see the word argument immediately in the question stem, so we know we're dealing with an argument task. And in this case, we're being asked to find a flaw in the argument regarding the work of Orson Welles. So we'll just put the word flaw here, and we're going to put PF as our predicted flaw. So, reading from the beginning, the films of Orson Welles are frequently cited as some of the most influential movies of all time, and many fundamental directorial techniques still used today can trace a lineage back to these works. Therefore, aspiring film students should study the work of Orson Welles to best learn the fundamentals of filmmaking. So, this is a relatively straightforward causality. You could probably also call it an evidence or data based argument, but here we'll just say that there is no other possible outcome from the facts about, we'll say, OW films, except that the aspiring students should study them. But since we're looking for a flaw, we need to show that there is, in fact, some other possible outcome from the facts. So we don't necessarily need to see these films if we're an aspiring film student and want to learn the fundamentals of filmmaking. So choice A does not consider that advancements in modern film technology could render previously fundamental directing techniques obsolete. Well, this is it, right? Like, that's directly it. This shows that the evidence can be interpreted another way. Orson Welles's infer the techniques are going to be obsolete. So that matches pretty directly. You can see how quickly this can work sometimes. Now, choice B assumes that Orson Welles is the greatest filmmaker of all time. Well, we don't need him to be the greatest filmmaker of all time. And that's just not what's happening here. So that's kind of a reversal of the task because it's not a flaw that's presented. They don't actually say that Orson Welles is the greatest filmmaker of all time. Then fails to consider the benefits of unconventional directorial approaches to the art form of film. Well, again, that's just not in the argument at all. So that's by default a task reversal because that's not a problem with the argument. There's nothing about unconventional directorial approaches. If anything, they may not be relevant because we're clearly talking about the fundamentals, not necessarily the unconventional approaches. So C would get eliminated for that reason. Choice D ignores the concerns of the modern film student in constructing a curriculum that would best bring their visions to the big screen. Well, again, we're not concerned with the modern film student. In fact, it may be the professor that's putting this forth. So once more, that's kind of by default a task reversal of the flaw because it's just not what's presented as a technical issue in the argument. And then require study of a filmmaker from the past who is likely unfamiliar to the modern film student. Well, again, if he's unfamiliar, maybe we need to study him. So that too would be a reversal. And we can see that the correct answer becomes relatively apparent whether we consider this as an evidence or data or a straight causality based argument because it focuses us on the specific issue that may trigger our brain to go, yeah, this is actually kind of a flawed argument proactively. And that's what the prediction is supposed to do. So when you're working through our big four of the argument tasks, assumption, flaw, strengthen, weaken, consider these common argument types to help expedite and improve your accuracy in working through these problems to boost your score on this aspect of the verbal reasoning section of the Gmat focus.